Welcome to the follow-up. This is the place where we explore questions you've submitted after Sunday's sermon. Maybe it's something that left you curious, confused, or inspired. We'll talk through it together. Ready? Let's get to the follow-up. Hello, welcome back to the follow-up podcast. Krystle and Shawn here, pastors at Life Community Church. How are you doing?
Doing good.
Yeah.
I was just snacking before we started on some of my favorite snacks, popcorn.
Popcorn.
Yeah.
It is one of the best snacks out there.
Brings me joy.
Brings me joy.
To help us connect the theme here
go.
today. Talking about joy.
Talking about joy, but not necessarily temporary, momentary joy, things like popcorn.
Yeah. So I think they're going to have popcorn in heaven.
They better.
Yeah.
I think, though, we talked on Sunday about what we're going to unpack here in a minute in terms of joy.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that God gives us these little glimpses of joy that help point us to the bigger things. I don't even think we have to feel guilty about finding joy in popcorn.
No way.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
So, joy, the third week of Advent.
Yes. It's been a journey.
It's been a journey.
I kind of feel like we're making the turn now from we started off with hope, right? In the sense of longing and holding on to hope when it feels like there's no light on the horizon, right? Mm-hmm. And then into peace, right? And when we take this journey, it feels more meaningful, right? Than just kind of blasting through the Christmas season like we typically do, just because of the nature of the time of year and stuff. And so, it feels kind of good to feel like, coming around the corner here. Yeah.
Heading towards the light.
Yep.
Yeah. You used Psalm 98 and then the song that was a poem, Joy to the World, that both of those things point us to a future reality. And you said, if we are willing to accept it, becomes a source of joy for us right in the middle of the mess. And I was thinking about, it's easy to have joy when things are going well. We can find it pretty easily. Mm-hmm. When we're in the middle of something, which we all are going to be at some point in our lives, it's harder to find that joy. And so what does it look like truly to accept that joy can be found in the middle of the mess? And what does it look like to hold on to joy, regardless of what kind of experiences we're having at that moment?
Yeah. Yeah, that's really good. And I think that's the challenge of joy is holding on to something when everything feels like it's falling apart, right? And so even as we preached this last Sunday, culturally and around the world, there were some devastating things that happened, even leading into that. Everything from shootings to floods to what in the world is going on? And so when I kind of look out over the horizon of that, it's do I hold on to, and it, all these themes kind of tie together, right? Do I hold on to the fact that God is still at work, and that as devastating maybe as things are, they aren't without hope. They're not without some sense of God's going to fix it. Yeah. And I think one of the challenges with joy, if we're willing to accept this reality that, man, I've got no other hope, I've got no other anything to hold on to, and unless I believe that God is going to do something about it, and that God is faithful. So that the idea behind the Psalm, right, is that God did something and God will do something. Yeah. And the psalmist lives in this reality even before Jesus, right? So they're banking on what God did, in bringing the Israelites out of Egypt and some of the ways that God has rescued them. And this idea that what God did is a sign for what God will do. Yeah. And therefore we can be people of joy, knowing that God will act. And one day God will win ultimately, right? Put all the things right again. And so I said, even on Sunday, it's a dangerous thing to talk about. This idea behind expectations and joy, and how do you have joy when things are devastating around you? And maybe, for me, I think I'm generally a fairly happy person. But sometimes it can be hard for me to conjure like that joy.
Yeah.
You know, and so even as I'm preaching the message, I'm like processing, like, what does it mean for me to be a person of joy, deep hope? You know, we talked about that Hebrews passage a couple weeks ago, right?
Yeah.
That's anchor, you know, for us to hold on to. And just this realization that, you know, this anticipation that God's going to make everything right. And so, like, how do I hold on to that sort of anticipation and expectation, even when struggle is in front of me? And that really is kind of the biblical example of joy. It's almost always like couched in the middle of struggle and trial. And so.
Yeah. You know, we often equate joy and happiness. We like try to interchange them. And, you know, the biblical, what we're talking about here, this kind of joy, it's not necessarily a feeling. It's like this knowing.
Yeah.
And, you know, for me to not necessarily feel joyful doesn't mean that I don't hang on to the promise that God is going to do something. And that's where I can find my joy. I was thinking on Sunday, you know, we were praying for some of the things you just mentioned that had happened across our world and even in our own, you know, Pacific Northwest area of flooding and then burdens for different people that are struggling. And then I walk out into the lobby after church and I'm handed a like 3-week-old baby boy. And I had deep joy in that moment. It wasn't just because he's so cute and it's so fun to hold a new baby, but it made me think of that God is still working. God's still like new babies are being born, new lives are being created. And this opportunity to see like just fresh from heaven that God is still at work. And just what a reminder that in the midst of it, that there is still good and God is still working and he's working all things together for his, you know, plans and purposes that are ultimately for our good.
Right.
And it was just like a tangible reminder for me in that moment, like, oh man, there's so much that God is doing if I just, you know, can take a moment to recognize that.
Yeah. We talked about, I think it was last week in the podcast, Simeon and Anna, right? In the temple, like when the joy that they have when, you know, the 8-day-old baby Jesus, right, comes in and they get to, like, can you imagine like the joy that, you know, that they had held on to for so long, right? That then overflows in that moment. So just when you get to hold that baby, it just reminds me of that scene of joy in the middle of the, you know, they're still under Roman occupation. There's still like all the things that are still there. I was just, as you were talking, I was thinking about the Romans 12 passage that says, be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, right? That joy is always like couched in some other reality. Like it's this, posture is not the right word, but this posture of our heart and our lives that kind of orients us around this belief of what God is doing. You know, and where like, you know, James talks about like having like joy in trouble. And when Jesus, you know, talks about, you know, for the joy set before him endured the cross, like it's always within the container of like real life. And how do we, and you even kind of talked about this, like, with the Pollyanna illustration in the first week, of like, hey, like it's not ignoring life's circumstances, but it's anticipating that God is at work within those. And I think like for me, like my takeaways from like the message prep, like trying to like internalize it for me. And I, you know, I hashed this around with you. It didn't all land in the message, but this idea between expectation and anticipation, and how do I develop eyes to see, to anticipate God working in every circumstance. And I think when we truly like anticipate something, that stirs, like we you know, we serve and know a good and loving God, right? And so even in the midst of really hard things, how do I develop eyes to see where God is working? And could that then produce joy in me? Like, hey man, this situation is really hard. And yet, I know and serve a good and loving God who is at work in this space somehow. Didn't cause it, like didn't like, but is at work in those spaces. You know, Jesus shows up in the broken spaces. And so that stirs, I think, a sense of joy in me. Like could it be that God is actually at work in the middle of the space? And that's the part kind of maybe tagging back to like, if we're willing to accept it, like if we're willing to say, you know what, as rough as this situation is, or as evil as this situation is, God can be at work in it. And in fact, God is at work in it. And most of the times we just haven't had the discipline or looked to see, to anticipate, okay, God, where are you going to be at work in this thing?
Yep.
And maybe that anticipation begins to stir some joy in us. But,
yeah. No, it's really good. I think we think, well, when everything is fine, then that's what I'll be able to experience true joy. But like you said, in our scriptures, it's always in the midst of all the stuff. And so instead of waiting for this someday when my life, looks exactly the way I want it to, then I'll feel joyful. What does it look like to open our eyes and to practice seeing and noticing where God's at work and finding our joy in that instead of our circumstances? That's a challenge for all of us.
Yeah. Somebody wrote a book, and I can't remember who it is. It's been a while. It's called Surprised by Joy.
Okay.
And just that idea that if we look for it, like if we look for where God is at work in our world, and it may be like in you in that space, right? Like, God, where are you working here? And then being surprised, right, when we see it, like, oh my gosh, like, and then stirring that sense of man, we do serve a good and loving God, who is at work in the middle of the pain, in the middle of the struggle, and in the middle of the injustice of our world and the things that happen in our lives. And so, I don't know, that was the takeaway for me, like in the message for me personally was, I don't have to feel joyful all the time, because I don't feel joyful all the time. Right. Oftentimes I'm frustrated, or like I can't figure things out, or I don't know how to like fix something or whatever. And probably don't spend enough time like, okay, God, where are you at work here? And like, if I learn to anticipate, you're already ahead of me. You're already in that space. Might that produce joy in me when I see it, right? And be, growing in that expectation of, God being at work.
Yeah. And it takes intentionality. I'm not going to accidentally find joy in the midst of difficulty unless we're willing to really intentionally sit and process and ask, and part of our practices help us do that. Spending time in prayer and scripture and silence and solitude, taking our Sabbath, all of that helps us to be more intentional about all the things that we're doing. The book was written by C.S. Lewis.
There it is. I knew it was somebody familiar.
In a while ago. So.
Yeah. And that happens. He writes that about, in the midst of some of his own difficulty and struggle and things that happened in his life. And so, I think like when, really the message of joy is for people that are struggling, right? And all about like, how do we have perspective? When James says, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. And then he goes on, because they produce something in you. And it's not like just like, it's going to make you a better person, but no, that God is at work. Like God is using those things, redeeming those things in us, and conforming us to his image. Jesus was a man of suffering, and yet he is our example of joy, right? And so how do I learn to have perspective that doesn't diminish the difficulty, but maybe gives more weight to, God, where are you at work in this? And how could I learn to see you in it? And would that then produce joy in me? And then ultimately, because I know, like, I've put all the chips on the table in terms of like, ultimately you're going to make it all right. Ultimately you set all things right. You make all things new. And that maybe helps us persevere in the hard stuff.
I was thinking, as you were talking about that, some of the people that I know that are the most joyful people have actually endured some of the hardest, most painful things in their lives, but have allowed God to use that and work in them. And you would never maybe know it from the outside. Right. And then you hear their story and you're like, how do you have joy still? And I think that's the key, is, what they've allowed the Spirit to do in them, and the depth then that where their joy comes from. It's just completely different. And not like I'm going to run full force into terrible things because it'll produce this, but we're going to face terrible, hard, difficult things. And what could we allow the Spirit to work out in us through those things?
Yeah. Yeah. Like I said, I don't think you go looking for it necessarily, but learning to see God in it.
Yeah.
Right. And again, through the whole New Testament, right, especially the letters, in the early church, we just see like this sense of joy, even in the midst of like the persecution they were facing and the trials that they faced and the hardship. There's a theme of like being considered worthy of suffering. Like they believed so much in what God was doing and what Jesus had done, that they were willing to suffer like Jesus did. And in the fact, so much so that they like considered it joy that they would be counted worthy of suffering. Right.
Yeah.
Like this completely different way of seeing their lives and their purpose in the world and what God would ultimately do in bringing about salvation. And like, how do we begin to shift our perspective a little bit to experience that? To put it all the way back into the Advent context, right? Just this reality that Jesus shows up, and the angels announce the good news of great joy. And Jesus had done nothing but show up, right? And yet the angels anticipate like one day when he will, go through a very awful thing, right? Of dying on the cross to bring about this goodness that the angels sing about. And so I think it's that idea that we hold on to like the moments we get right now, but ultimately that God will finish what God set out to do. And so we can kind of hold both of those things in tension. So as you journey into the Advent season, maybe who knows where you're at in your joy journey. But maybe God's Spirit would then just produce that joy in you. And even as you experience maybe those little moments of popcorn or hot cocoa or time with family or any of those things, they might be, like you said earlier, just a little flicker, a little glimpse of the ultimate goodness and joy that God will one day bring. So
Yep. Well, that's it for joy. We have one more week of Advent left.
Yep.
So we're going to be talking about love.
Love.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
It's a good one. Yeah. So have a great week.
Thanks. We'll see you next week.
That's a wrap for today. Stay curious and we'll see you next week.